She represents the future Angela, he sneered, his eyes tracing the lines on my face with a cruelty I didn't recognize after 10 years together. You're just a failure who doesn't understand how legacy is built. You're an advisor who can't even advise herself out of a dead-end life. You're done. The air in the private wealth office was ice cold, but it was Richard's voice that froze my blood. Without blinking, he pushed a transfer confirmation for $4 million across the mahogany desk straight into the manicured hands of Vanessa, a woman half my age. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply took a breath, requested a certified copy of that transaction, and walked out into the rain in total silence. He thought he had stripped me of my dignity. He thought he had left me with nothing. He was dead wrong. Fast forward 48 hours. My phone has been vibrating off the hook for 3 hours straight. It's Richard's high-priced lead counsel. His voice, usually booming with arrogance, is now thin, reeking of panic. He keeps repeating the same 2 words, "That's impossible." But it isn't impossible. It's a legal landslide. Stay with me because today I'm going to show you exactly how a man's ego can become his own executioner. You are about to witness a masterclass in calculated revenge, a journey involving a secret heir, a fail-safe clause hidden in plain sight. And the moment Richard realized that while he had the money, I had the keys to the kingdom. By the time this story ends, you'll see why you should never call a woman a failure until you're sure she isn't the one holding your entire life together. My name is Angela Hale, and at 39, I have spent nearly 2 decades carving out a reputation as one of the most meticulous senior wealth advisors in the industry. While others my age were focused on climbing social ladders, I was the architect behind the Hale family's financial fortress, transforming Richard's erratic ambitions into a sophisticated global empire. I was never just his fiancé. I was the strategic brain that kept his world spinning, which made it all the more jarring when he decided to treat my years of expertise as nothing more than an inconvenient souvenir from his past. The glass-walled conference room at the bank was suffocatingly bright, overlooking the sprawling skyline that Richard intended to conquer. He sat there, his tailored suit without a single wrinkle, looking every bit the powerful patriarch he imagined himself to be. Beside him sat Vanessa, a woman who radiated a calculated, youthful charm that Richard mistook for genuine brilliance. The banker placed the transfer documents on the table with a heavy silence, and I watched Richard's hand hover over the signature line with a sense of grim inevitability. With a flourish of his fountain pen, he authorized the transfer of $4 million from the Hale Strategic Legacy Trust directly into the accounts of Vanessa's fledgling nonprofit. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and unspoken betrayal. Richard didn't just sign the paper. He looked up at the banker, then at me, with a condescending smirk that made my skin crawl. He told the room that he was finally taking the reins from someone who was merely a loyal employee, but lacked the vision to actually build a legacy. He called me a failure of an advisor, a woman who stayed in the safe lanes while he was meant for the fast ones. Vanessa offered a small, pitying smile that was sharper than any blade. I felt the heat rising in my chest, the instinct to defend nearly 20 years of flawless service, but I pushed it down. I chose the path of the observer. I didn't argue. I didn't flinch. Instead, I waited for the ink to dry and calmly requested a certified, time-stamped copy of the transaction. I needed the record to show not just the amount, but the sheer reckless arrogance with which it was delivered. My mind drifted back to a rainy Tuesday 3 weeks prior, a moment Richard had likely forgotten, but one I had meticulously engineered. We had been sitting in his study, and I had played the role of the supportive, slightly worried partner. I had leaned over his shoulder and whispered a suggestion about civic alignment. I told him that if he truly wanted that seat on the City Development Council, a bold, unilateral gesture of philanthropy would make him look like a leader who didn't need to ask for permission. I framed it as a maverick move, knowing exactly how much Richard loved that word. He had beamed at me feeling like he was outsmarting the world, entirely unaware that I was leading him toward a cliff. I knew the internal bylaws of the Hale Trust better than the back of my own hand. The trust had a rigid discretionary limit. Any transfer exceeding 2% of the total assets that involved a potential conflict of interest required a full board review. By handing $4 million to his mistress's foundation under the guise of political strategy, Richard wasn't just being a maverick, he was committing a textbook breach of fiduciary duty. Once the meeting concluded and Richard walked out with Vanessa on his arm, leaving me to gather my things like a discarded assistant, I finally looked at the transfer memo in the quiet of the empty room. There it was written in his bold, sweeping script, Strategic Civic Alignment Initiative. Those 3 words were his death knell. By linking the trust's money directly to his personal political ambitions, he had stripped away any defense of charitable intent. He had used family legacy funds to buy himself a seat at a political table, a move that violated every ethical and legal boundary his father had established decades ago. I left the building with the certified copy tucked safely in my briefcase, but I didn't head to my lawyer's office. Not yet. Instead, I drove to my home office and opened a digital file I had been building in secret for years. It wasn't filled with financial spreadsheets or tax returns. It was filled with the life of a woman named Elena Marlowe, a school principal in a quiet corner of Ohio who had no idea she was the missing piece of the Hale family puzzle. Richard thought he had finally silenced me, believing his wealth made him untouchable. He had spent the morning gloating about his power, convinced that I was a broken woman with no cards left to play. He was so blinded by his own reflection that he couldn't see the paper trail I was laying out behind him. Richard thought he was signing a check for his future. He didn't realize he was signing the warrant for his own downfall. The drive home from the wealth office felt shorter than usual, the certified copy of Richard's betrayal sitting on the passenger seat like a dormant explosive. As I reached my sanctuary, a quiet, light-filled study that Richard had always dismissed as my little hobby room, I felt the weight of the last decade begin to shift. For years, I had been the guardian of the Hale legacy, a role that required me to see everything, even the things the family tried to bury under layers of prestige and philanthropy. Richard viewed my 39 years of life as a mere prelude to his greatness, but he had forgotten that a wealth advisor's greatest asset isn't her ability to pick stocks. It is her access to the truth. I opened my laptop and navigated past the public ledgers and family trees, moving deep into the encrypted archives of the Hale Strategic Legacy Trust. Most of the world believed the late Arthur Hale had 3 children, 3 pillars of New England society who inherited his vast fortune and his stern moral code. But 4 years ago, while auditing a dusty annex labeled Schedule C, a document so confidential it was never meant to be digitized, I found the 4th pillar. Her name was Elena Marlowe, a name that never appeared in the society pages or the family obituaries. Elena was the result of a quiet long-term affair Arthur had maintained decades ago, a secret he had tried to reconcile by quietly adding her as a beneficiary in the trust's final revision. She was the shameful secret, the illegitimate daughter kept in the shadows to preserve the polished mahogany image of the Hale name. I leaned back, my eyes fixed on Elena's current life. She was a high school principal in a modest town in Ohio, a woman who had built a life on discipline and service, seemingly unaware that she was legally entitled to a staggering portion of the empire Richard was currently squandering. My connection to her wasn't just through a screen. 2 years ago, I had intentionally taken on a pro bono consulting project for her school district's pension fund. I had walked the same hallways she walked, sat in meetings across from her, and watched her interact with students with a grace that Richard could never emulate. I had watched over her interests from a distance, ensuring her modest school funds were protected, all while keeping the secret of her birth locked in the back of my mind. I didn't reach out to her then because the time wasn't right, and I had hoped perhaps naively that Richard would never force my hand. But as I stared at the $4 million transfer memo, I realized that by protecting the Hale family's secrets, I was becoming complicit in Richard's theft of Elena's rightful inheritance. The bridge between us was no longer just professional. It had become an ethical necessity. Richard had called me a failure because I valued stability over his reckless ambition, but he was about to learn that stability is built on foundations he had spent his life ignoring. I picked up the phone and called Martha, a veteran estate attorney who had been my mentor since I was a junior associate. Martha didn't need a lengthy explanation. She understood the language of fiduciary war. I laid out the situation: the transfer to Vanessa, the violation of the 2% discretionary limit, and the existence of the Schedule C beneficiary. Martha's voice was sharp and clinical as she explained the legal trigger we were about to pull. As a listed beneficiary, Elena Marlowe held a power that Richard in his arrogance had never bothered to investigate. She had the absolute, undeniable right to demand a formal accounting of the trust's activities. In the world of high-stakes trusts, a formal accounting is the equivalent of a forensic colonoscopy. It would force Richard to open every book, justify every dollar, and explain exactly why $4 million of trust capital was sitting in the bank account of a private nonprofit run by his mistress. If Richard refused the accounting, he would look guilty of criminal concealment. If he complied, his violation of the trust's bylaws would be laid bare for the board and the IRS to see. This wasn't about a scorned woman seeking revenge. This was about a trustee who had forgotten that his power was a loan, not a gift. I spent the next 3 hours drafting an email to Elena. I didn't lead with the drama or the family scandal. Instead, I wrote with the professional clarity that had defined my career. I reminded her of our work together 2 years ago, and then pivotally, I attached the confidential Schedule C document alongside the $4 million transfer receipt. I explained that her father had intended for this trust to be a shield for all his children, and that the shield was currently being dismantled by a man who saw her existence as a footnote. I didn't ask her to sue her brother or to blow up the family name for a headline. I simply told her that she had the key to unlock her father's true intentions, and that I was standing by to help her turn it. I hit send at midnight, the silence of my house feeling like the breath before a plunge. I knew that Elena Marlowe wasn't a greedy woman. She was a woman of principle, much like myself. Richard had spent the day treating me like a disposable employee, convinced that my silence could be bought or bullied. He had no idea that I had spent the last 2 years quietly building a relationship with the one person who could strip him of his managing authority with a single signature. I lay awake for hours watching the shadows of the trees dance on my ceiling, waiting for the world to change. The tension in my chest didn't break until the glow of my phone illuminated the dark room. Elena's reply arrived at 3 a.m. It wasn't a request for money, it was a request for war. The intensity in Elena's early morning email was a catalyst that transformed my quiet observations into a strategic strike. As I sat in my study with Martha and Elena, the latter appearing via a secure video link from her modest living room in Ohio, I felt the pieces of a 20-year-old puzzle finally clicking into place. Richard had always viewed the trust as a personal piggy bank, a reward for his birthright. But as I navigated through the digital layers of the original agreement, I prepared to show them the teeth hidden within the fine print. I directed their attention to an obscure hand-annotated codicil that had been buried in the final 18th Amendment of the document, a section Arthur Hale had insisted on adding just months before his passing. This was the Silent Guardian Clause, a sophisticated failsafe designed by a man who loved his son but understood his flaws with devastating clarity. The clause was surgical in its precision. It stated that if any managing trustee engaged in political self-dealing or willfully ignored the 2% discretionary spending limit on conflicted transactions, the co-beneficiaries possessed the unilateral power to trigger an immediate, non-negotiable suspension of the trustee's powers. This wasn't just a hurdle for Richard, it was a trapdoor. By transferring that $4 million to Vanessa's nonprofit under the banner of civic alignment, Richard hadn't just been arrogant, he had stepped directly onto the trigger Arthur had set decades ago. Elena watched in silence as Martha confirmed the legality of the clause, her eyes widening as she realized that her father, a man she had only known through hushed secrets and monthly checks, had actually given her the power to protect his legacy from his own legitimate heir. But the most profound revelation was yet to come, one that validated every sacrifice I had made in my career. I reached into the back of my safe and pulled out a cream-colored envelope, the paper heavy and textured. It was a private letter Arthur had entrusted to me during our final meeting at the hospice, with strict instructions to open it only if the integrity of the Hale name was ever traded for personal vanity. I read the words aloud, my voice steady despite the emotion swelling in my throat. In the letter, Arthur admitted that he had watched Richard's ego grow into a dangerous force, a hunger for power that lacked a moral compass. He wrote that he had handpicked me to be the family's lead advisor, not just for my financial acumen, but because he saw in me a moral spine that Richard lacked. He described me as the hand-picked guardian of the family's soul, the only person he trusted to recognize when the intoxication of power had gone too far. Hearing those words, Elena's expression shifted from uncertainty to a fierce, quiet resolve. For the first time, I wasn't just an employee or a jilted fiancé. I was the executor of a father's final desperate hope for his family. This letter proved that I had never been the failure Richard claimed I was. I had been the failsafe all along, the hidden variable in a grand equation that Richard was too self-absorbed to solve. The final step of the morning required a journey to the past that I had been dreading. I drove to the secluded Hale estate in the Berkshires to meet with Silas Vance, the 90-year-old former executor and Arthur's lifelong confidant, who still held the honorary title of trust overseer. Silas sat in a sun-drenched library surrounded by the leather-bound history of a dynasty he had helped build. When I laid the certified transfer receipt and the memo for the Strategic Civic Alignment Initiative on his desk, the silence in the room became deafening. I watched the old man's hands tremble as he adjusted his spectacles to read the proof of Richard's betrayal. The disappointment that settled on his face was palpable, a heavy shroud that seemed to age him by another decade in an instant. He realized with a clarity that only the elderly can possess that Richard hadn't just spent $4 million. He had gambled the entire estate's reputation on a political vanity project, inviting a public tax scandal that could trigger an IRS audit of every Hale asset. The high society facade that Silas had spent 60 years polishing was beginning to crumble, and for the first time, the patriarch's inner circle saw Richard not as a successor, but as a liability. Silas looked up at me, his eyes clouded but sharp with a newfound respect, and gave me a single slow nod. The family's elite protection was being withdrawn, and the immunity Richard had enjoyed his entire life was vanishing. As I left the estate, I saw the news alerts on my phone about Richard's upcoming gala, where he intended to announce his council run. He was at the height of his delusion, surrounded by sycophants and champagne, completely unaware that the very foundation he stood upon had been dismantled. Richard was preparing his victory speech for the council, unaware that his father's ghost was about to take the microphone. The heavy silence of the Hale estate stayed with me as I drove back toward the city, but my mind was already moving toward a confrontation Richard would never expect. Most women in my position would have spent their energy plotting Vanessa's social ruin, but 39 years of navigating corporate warfare had taught me that a woman's anger is far less effective than her clarity. I arranged a private meeting with Vanessa at a quiet, out-of-the-way bistro far from the prying eyes of the high society circles. She was so desperate to join. When she arrived, she wore that same practiced air of youthful triumph, her chin tilted up as if she had already won. I didn't give her time to speak. I simply laid a thick manila folder on the table between us. Inside were the internal ledger entries Richard had finalized just hours after the public transfer. I watched the color drain from her face as I pointed to the fine print where Richard had officially classified the $4 million not as a charitable grant, but as a repayable loan to her nonprofit. I watched her eyes dart across the page, realizing for the first time that Richard had effectively saddled her organization with a debt it could never pay, essentially turning her passion project into a high-interest liability. I leaned in, my voice calm and devoid of malice, and explained the terrifying reality of his gift. When the inevitable audit hit and I made it clear that I was the one ensuring Vanessa wouldn't be seen as a visionary leader. She would be the one facing charges of charity fraud and mismanagement, while Richard, the polished politician, would claim he was merely a generous donor who had been misled by her financial incompetence. I showed her the mirror of his truth to Richard. She wasn't a partner. She was a disposable political shield designed to take the impact when his ambitions finally crashed. The realization shattered Vanessa's loyalty in a way no argument ever could. The youthful arrogance vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp survival instinct that I recognized and respected. She didn't cry or beg. She reached into her designer bag and pulled out her tablet, showing me a series of internal emails Richard had sent her over the last 6 months. They were devastating. In his own words, Richard had explicitly detailed how he intended to use her nonprofit as a reputation-laundering vehicle for the upcoming election, even joking about how easy it was to bypass trust oversight by masking political spending as civic reform. As we sat there, the mistress and the advisor, two women Richard had spent months pitting against each other, we formed the ultimate alliance. This was the twist Richard's ego had never allowed him to anticipate. He believed that because we occupied different spaces in his life, we would never compare notes. He relied on our perceived rivalry to keep his secrets safe. But by the time our coffee was cold, his two greatest assets, the woman who managed his money and the woman who held his heart, had become his two most dangerous witnesses. Vanessa handed over the encrypted email chains, her defection complete. She wasn't doing it for me, and I wasn't doing it for her. We were both doing it for the only thing Richard truly understood: self-preservation. The following morning, the atmosphere in the Hale Trust boardroom was electric with a tension that Richard was too blinded by his own momentum to notice. He entered the room with his signature bravado, his footsteps echoing on the polished marble as he adjusted his silk tie in a nearby mirror. He had called this meeting, he thought, to officially terminate my contract and consolidate his power before his council announcement. He walked to the head of the table, already beginning a practiced speech about new directions and realigning the family vision. But as he looked around the table, the bravado faltered. Instead of the usual group of aging, compliant board members, he found himself staring at a unified front of women he had consistently underestimated. There was Martha, her legal documents spread out like a battle plan. There was Elena Marlowe appearing via a high-definition screen, her presence as a co-beneficiary, a silent looming threat to his authority. And sitting at the far end of the table, I held a printed statement from Vanessa detailing every fraudulent conversation and every manipulative email he had ever sent her. Richard's mouth went dry as he realized the room had been turned into a courtroom and he was the only one on trial. The presentation of evidence was surgical. I didn't raise my voice as I walked the committee through the financial labyrinth Richard had built. I showed them the repayable loan trap he had set for Vanessa, the violation of the 2% limit, and the direct link between trust funds and his personal political campaign. Elena spoke then, her voice coming through the speakers with a moral authority that silenced Richard's attempt to interrupt. She officially invoked the silent guardian clause, citing his fiduciary negligence and his attempt to conceal her existence from the trust's filings. Richard tried to laugh it off, his eyes darting toward the elder board members, searching for the wink or the nod that had always bailed him out of trouble. He tried to use his charm, pivoting to a story about unforeseen complexities and visionary risks. He looked for a sympathetic ear, a fellow maverick who would understand that the rules were for other people, not for a Hale. But as he looked from face to face, he saw only the cold, hard reflection of his own betrayal. The women in the room weren't just presenting numbers. They were presenting the bill for a lifetime of arrogance. Richard looked for a friendly face in the room, but for the first time in his life, his charm had no currency. The silence following the committee's vote was more devastating than any shouting match could have been. In a unanimous show of hands, the board invoked the failsafe, and I watched as Richard's face turned a ghostly ashen gray. The transition was instantaneous and brutal. Martha, acting with the clinical efficiency of a surgeon, slid a series of revocation documents across the table. With those signatures, Richard was stripped of his managing trustee status, his signature authority was deactivated in real time by the bank, and his access to the very office we were sitting in was revoked. For a man like Richard, who equated his pulse with his power to move millions, this was an administrative death. I watched him reach for his gold-plated fountain pen, his hand trembling with a rage he could no longer voice. He wasn't just losing a job, he was losing the only version of himself he knew how to be. Without the title, without the ability to command a room with a wire transfer, he looked smaller, older, and utterly hollow. He tried to stand, perhaps intending to make a grand exit, but realized he had nowhere to go. His keycard was already a useless piece of plastic in his pocket. He was reduced to an observer of his own life, a ghost haunting the corridors of a legacy that had officially moved on without him. The true catharsis, however, came with the price of his silence. to avoid the public spectacle of a tax evasion lawsuit and the potential for criminal fraud charges that would have permanently barred him from any political office. Richard was forced into a corner with no exits. Martha and I had prepared the terms of his surrender with agonizing precision. First, he was required to personally reimburse the trust for every cent of the $4 million he had squandered on Vanessa's nonprofit using his private non-trust funds. I watched the physical pain on his face as he realized he was paying $4 million for a political campaign that was already dead in the water. But the financial blow was secondary to the humiliation I had planned for the failure he had called me in that glass room. I insisted on a formal written confession of his breach of fiduciary judgment. I didn't want it kept in a private file. I mandated that this letter be sent to every single board member, banker, and political donor he had mocked or belittled over the last year. He had to sit there and sign dozens of letters, each one an admission that his arrogance had led to a catastrophic failure of character. Watching him eat the humble pie he had tried to serve me was a quiet, cold satisfaction that tasted better than any win in my 20-year career. Every stroke of his pen was a retraction of the insults he had hurled at me, a permanent record of his fall from grace. In the wake of his removal, the room turned its attention to the future, and it was Elena Marlowe who delivered the final blow to Richard's ego. Richard had assumed that if he was out, his secret sister would naturally hunger for his throne, perpetuating the cycle of family greed he understood so well. He looked at the screen, likely expecting Elena to gloat or claim the managing trustee role for herself. Instead, Elena spoke with a moral clarity that redefined the entire concept of the Hale legacy. She calmly refused the position, stating that the family had spent too long treating a public trust like a private fiefdom. She proposed the immediate formation of an independent fiduciary board, a group of outside professionals with no blood ties and no personal agendas to manage the assets with total transparency. It was the ultimate act of moral superiority. She didn't want the power. She wanted the integrity. She then turned her gaze to me and made a recommendation that silenced the room. She asked that I be appointed as the ethical oversight consultant for the new board. I wouldn't be working for a Hale anymore. I would be the guardian of the standards they had failed to meet. Richard realized then that while he still had his personal millions and his expensive cars, he had lost the legacy, the one thing he had claimed I was too small to understand. He had confused control with legacy, and now he had neither. As the meeting adjourned, I gathered my files with the same calm I had maintained since the beginning. Richard stayed in his chair staring at the mahogany table as if waiting for a miracle that wasn't coming. He had signed the confession he had authorized the reimbursement, and he believed the nightmare was over. He caught my eye for a fleeting second, a look of desperate, wounded pride searching for some sign of the woman he thought he could dominate. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a smile or a taunt. I simply nodded to the security detail waiting at the door to escort him out of the building. He walked past me, his shoulders slumped, clutching the briefcase that no longer held any power. He thought the paperwork was the end of the ordeal, a messy chapter he could eventually spin or bury with enough time and money. He thought he had signed his way out of trouble. He didn't realize that in the world of high finance, a lost reputation is a permanent debt. The dust from Richard's spectacular fall took months to settle, but when it did, the landscape of the Hale family had changed irrevocably. 6 months have passed since that final board meeting, and the transformation of the Hale Strategic Legacy Trust has become a blueprint for modern fiduciary reform. Under the new guard of the independent board, the secrecy and shadows that once defined the family's wealth have been replaced by a rigorous, radical transparency. Elena Marlowe. The woman Richard once dismissed as a non-entity has become the heart of this new era. Using her rightful share of the trust funds that had been accumulating for 18 years, she didn't buy a penthouse or a yacht. Instead, she broke ground on a state-of-the-art educational and vocational wing at her high school in Ohio, naming it after her father. It was the first time Arthur Hale's name was associated with something purely for the public good rather than private influence. I traveled to the opening ceremony and watched as Elena, standing tall and proud, was greeted not as a secret sibling, but as a visionary leader. The shadow of her birth has been completely eclipsed by the light of her service, and in the eyes of the remaining Hale elders, she has become the most respected member of the lineage. She honored her father's name in a way Richard's political donations never could, proving that the value of a legacy is measured by who it lifts up, not how much it costs. Richard's exit from the world he so desperately craved was not a loud explosion, but a slow, agonizing fade into irrelevance. Within weeks of the accountability letter reaching the hands of the city's power brokers, his political allies vanished like smoke. The City Development Council race, which he had considered his birthright, became an impossibility. No party would touch a man whose own trust board had formally censured him for fiduciary negligence. He was forced to withdraw his candidacy in a terse 2-paragraph press release that cited personal reasons, but everyone in the circles that matter knew the truth. Richard remains wealthy. His personal inheritance was too vast to fully deplete, but he has discovered that in high society, money without a title or respect is just a pile of paper. He is now a nobody in the rooms where he once demanded a standing ovation. I saw him once from across a gala floor. He looked diminished, a man watching from the sidelines of a game he no longer knows how to play. While he retreated into a quiet, bitter seclusion, I found myself in a position I never sought but now deeply value. I was recently featured on the cover of a major business journal not as a jilted fiancé or a failure, but as a pioneer in corporate and familial ethical reform. The industry now looks to me as the strategist who dismantled a dynasty's corruption to save its soul. And the irony is not lost on me that Richard's attempt to humiliate me was the very thing that launched my greatest professional ascent. My new office is a reflection of this clarity, a space defined by light and open lines rather than heavy mahogany and dark secrets. I sit here now, 39 years old, and finally at peace with the weight of my responsibilities, overlooking the city that Richard once thought he could buy with a $4 million check. On my desk sits a small framed photograph of the late Mr. Hale, taken during one of our early working sessions when he still had the strength to look me in the eye and talk about the future. I used to think my job was simply to move money to balance ledgers and to protect the assets from market volatility. I thought I was a follower of a legacy, a caretaker of someone else's history. But as I look at that photo, I realize that true power has nothing to do with the ability to sign a wire transfer or command a staff. True power is the character required to protect the truth when it is most inconvenient and the courage to hold the powerful accountable to the people they represent. I have moved from the woman who guarded the secrets to the woman who defines the standards. The silence of this room is different than the silence I kept for a decade. It is the silence of a woman who no longer has to hide the cracks in a foundation she didn't build. Vanessa has moved on as well, her nonprofit now operating under strict oversight, a lesson learned the hard way about the price of political shields. Elena and I speak weekly, our bond forged in the fire of that boardroom, a testament to what happens when women choose alliance over rivalry. Richard thought he could break me by taking my title and calling me a failure, but he only succeeded in stripping away the distractions that kept me from seeing my own strength. He spent his life building a facade of greatness, believing that if the building was tall enough and the name was gold enough, no one would look at the rot in the basement. He didn't understand that a legacy isn't a monument to a person, it is a promise to the future. I have spent the last 6 months ensuring that promise is finally kept built on the integrity that Richard viewed as a weakness. He thought legacy was about the name on the building. I proved it's about the truth kept inside the walls. Thank you for following Angela's journey from a dismissed advisor to the architect of a new family legacy. If you found this story of calculated justice and female empowerment inspiring, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and join our growing community of viewers who value integrity over ego. We want to hear from you in the comments below. Did Richard get exactly what he deserved, or do you think Angela should have taken even more from him? Many of our viewers have shared that the most satisfying part was seeing the alliance between Angela, Elena, and Vanessa, proving that when women stand together, even the most arrogant empires can be brought to account. Your insights and stories help us grow, and we love highlighting the best audience perspectives in our upcoming videos. By subscribing, you ensure you never miss a masterclass in resilience and the ultimate payoff of playing the long game. Thank you for watching, for your incredible engagement, and for standing with us as we celebrate the power of truth. We look forward to reading your thoughts and seeing you in the next story. Your support makes this channel possible, and we are grateful to have you as part of our journey toward justice.